to see you. I know you're busy historically in Black History Month there in the UK. As you know, here in the US we have those in February. But I think you and I, Black History Month is every month.
Amen. Amen.
Yes. Amen or Amun.
Amen.
Yes. And speaking of Amun, I want us to deal, substantially with African spirituality today, because I think it's the basis of everything. And if we can get to an understanding of African spirituality, we can get to an understanding of African culture. And African culture has a diversity, but it's a diversity that's a historical fact that has occurred over time, depending on circumstances, and of course, history itself, meaning time. And, the reason why I say this, and this is going to be a long introductory statement in a sense, because I just got back from Suriname. And as you know, Robin, and maybe you can touch on this, you may know even more than I do about Suriname. But Suriname was one of those countries. Of course, it was colonized by the Dutch and taken over by the Dutch, and the Dutch brought enslaved people, from West or Central Africa into that area of South America. It's on the north coast of South America, sort of next to Guyana, and Brazil is also a next door neighbor. But what is interesting about Suriname is the maybe it's a pejorative term at this point, so-called bush Negroes, but Maroons. Who escaped from slavery and went into what's basically the Amazon jungle and lived there and developed their own civilization, shall we say, in the villages, very much like the Quilombos in Brazil. So they've done that over time. And we went there at the invitation of the vice president, who is a Maroon. And this is historic, because he's obviously part of the government at a very, very high level. And part of the delegation was a number of kings and queens from Africa. So it was a cultural entity. And it was good to see the similarities, if you will, because we went out into the villages as well as being in the main town, Paramaribo. So it was enlightening. But again, the royals are from different cultural backgrounds in Africa. We had those from Ghana, we had those from Nigeria, we had those from Kenya, we had those from South Africa, and we had one from Niger, who essentially was very much a sultan and very much in the ancient Islamic type of thing, like the Sardano of Sokoto type of person. So there was that mix. So there was obviously a superficial difference in terms of cultures, but there's a deeper consistency, and I think that is what is important, because I think that deeper consistency comes out of the spirituality that is basic to Africans, and as you and I know, and maybe you can pick up on this and elaborate on this. Is that the spiritual aspect of our culture has been carried over and manifested, certainly in terms of voodoo, if you will, or vodun, whatever the correct term is, certainly in Haiti and in other parts. And then, of course, as we know, in Brazil, especially in Bahia, the Yoruba culture is very strong. In Jamaica, we have our Maroons, and the identification may be very much more with Ghana, but it's also a mix. So, this is ultimately what unites us is our spirituality. But it manifests in a diversity of different ways. And I think, for example, even the Rastafarians, looking to Ethiopia, but it's very much a spiritual thing in terms of Jah, which is the Rastafarian name for God, and that, of course, is simply a name for the Supreme Creator as a spiritual entity. So wherever we have gone, we have maintained our spirituality, even though, again, there is some cultural diversity on top of it. I think if you go all the way back, whether it's to Kemet, Ethiopia, Kush, Nubia, and so on, I think you find that the human being, and going back beyond time in that sense to Homo sapiens sapiens, the human being is searching for a relationship between divinity, if you will, and nature, and our own humanity. And obviously, when we say nature, we include not just plants per se, but animals, the rocks, the water, the earth, the air, and of course other human beings. And if you look at it, there is that primordial understanding that there's a supreme being, and the supreme being gave birth to us in terms of our creativity, and in terms of that creativity, we are all manifestations of that supreme being. And it goes back to nature and Neteru, with all the different functionalities of that supreme being manifested in nature. So if you look at all African religions, I think you'll find right from the start that they're nature religions. By that meaning that they see divinity in everything around them. So there's nothing that is not sacred. The individual is sacred, the plants are sacred, the ground is sacred, and so we're born environmentalists. And we would not, in our civilization, create the climate disaster that is being created at the present time, because nature is part of that trinity, if you will, meaning divinity, nature, and us. And it brings to mind a favorite quotation, of my dad: God and nature first made us what we are, and then out of our own creative genius, we make ourselves what we want to be. Follow always that great law, and let the sky be our limit, and eternity our measurement. And again, that's a whole cosmological understanding, I think, of African spirituality, and how Africans see meaning in life, in that there's an order to everything, and it's a divine order, meaning that there's an interconnectivity, therefore, of divinity, nature, and humanity. There's a link there, and there's a unity. And that, in the original sense, it's Ma'at, which is the order and harmony and balance within the universe. And then certainly later on in the Bantu philosophy, if you will, it is Ubuntu, because you're I am, and because I am we are. So there's that unity in terms of everything. And then that manifests itself in society on a day-to-day basis. So I think African spirituality is key to an understanding of the African person, to an understanding of African cultures. And then, we get all the way back down to reparations, because what has happened, as you know, and we've talked about, before, is that there have been incursions of Islam on the east, the north, and the east, Christianity on the west and on the south, and between both religions, we have been disconnected from our original understanding of who we are as human beings, how we relate to nature, and how we relate to each other. And in order to, please jump in now. Yeah, but anytime.
Yeah, what you've said there is very, very profound. So let me put a shape to it.
Yeah,
Professor Maulana Karenga, in a book called Introduction to Black Studies,
yeah.
he identified the common features that run across traditional African religions. And then other scholars have added to it and added to it. You mentioned the connection between the individual or the human, divinity and nature. There's even a book by a Nigerian philosopher in this country called Chukwuniri Kamalu called Person, Divinity, and Nature. And some of the similarities that Karenga has spotted, he spotted. So let me put together the most important ones. The first feature is that every location of Africa had its own understanding of the divine force or forces. And that local understanding meant that no one would ever be forced to convert from one tradition to another. And there was mutual respect between the different traditions. So if you lived in the area that we would today call Nigeria, if you lived in the Igbo territories, the largest shrine was Chukwu. And if you were in the Yoruba territories, the most important deity would be Olodumare. And there'll be no conversion from Chukwu to Olodumare or vice versa, because the mutual respect would already be built in. The second feature is you would have this idea that a human being could become a part of the Godhead if their deeds in life were great enough and the society chose to deify that human being. So if we take, for example, Shango, who is now a Yoruba deity, was originally a Yoruba king who was associated with great contributions to metallurgy, and the result is the Yoruba community have deified him. A third feature would be the deity being near and far. Immanent, meaning inside you, inside things, inside animals, inside the rocks, and transcendent out there in the heavens somewhere. And then the idea of intermediaries existing between the near and the far. And those intermediaries will be the Orishas, if you're in the Yoruba tradition, sake of argument, or the Numo in the Dogon tradition. Then we have another set of intermediaries, which will be the ancestors, and the ancestors being revered because of their contributions to the life of the community, their role as guardians of tradition and life. And they were seen as the ideal intermediaries, and you would communicate with them through the pouring of water in some traditions, the pouring of spirits in another tradition. People call this communication libations. Then we have the idea of religion or spirituality or tradition acting as a social glue, gluing the community together. And that meant, as you rightly say, sir, that in traditional African societies, there was no division between the secular and the divine. It was all divine. And consequently, our kings were not politicians, they were closer to being priests. And their religious function. So if we're dealing with the pharaohs of Kemet, they were very, very much the guardians of Ma'at. In other words, that was their job. Their job was a religious job, not necessarily a political one, although the two have now overlapped. According to the Reverend Canon John Mbiti, it's almost like I am because we are, and since we are, therefore I am. Another feature, as you rightly say, sir, is the reverence for nature, where you have sacred trees, sacred rivers, sacred mountains, and sacred animals. So if you're dealing with, say, the Igbo tradition, Idemili is the Ogilisi tree. I visited the East African coast and I visited some of the East African cities, and they would have a mosque for your Muslims, and then they would have the baobab tree for your traditionalists. And the baobab tree becomes the place of reverence and serenity. Then we have the idea of death being a stage in the life cycle. And as long as the living continue to speak your name and venerate your name, you are still a part of the living. And then, of course, you've got the final thing, which is the split between the esoteric and the exoteric, where the esoteric is where you've got the deep aspects of the religion or spirituality, including astronomy, including readings, including the hard sciences, including numerology and so on. And then you've got the exoteric, which is the instruction for the masses. And so these 8 features run through. And as you rightly say, sir, with people being captured and enslaved and being dragged across the Atlantic Ocean, the Yoruba tradition has more or less survived intact. Certainly in places like Cuba, that is the state religion. It's not Catholicism as most people think. It's actually the Yoruba tradition. The Cuban version of it's called Santeria. In places like Brazil, it's a big part of Black Brazilian culture, and for that matter, non-Black Brazilian culture, because a lot of them are into it as well. And then we have in Trinidad, it's a big part of African culture in Trinidad. So we can see examples where the traditional African religion, the traditional African spirituality has more or less survived intact. And that's been the most impressive example. Now, in Jamaica, you've got bits of the Kumina tradition. Some people in Jamaica, they call it Pocomania, which I gather is from Congo. And obviously, there's the Ghanaian Ashanti-ish tradition that the Maroons brought over. And our culture is a mixture of all of that.
Absolutely, absolutely, absolutely. And the thing is that the essence of it is not recognized, shall we say, anymore in a conscious manner, because what we have just talked about informed day-to-day life. As we say, everything was sacred, and your work was sacred. Your work was really a ritual. It wasn't so much a work, because what you were doing, you were sharing with the community. It wasn't just for yourself. It was always a communal exercise in terms of what you're doing, because we're all part of one thing. So there's the family, there's the extended family, which is then there's the community, and then there's the nation. But it all spreads out and has a unifying essence to it. So there was no estrangement one from another. There were no strangers, so to speak, because we're all grounded in the same spirituality, and we have that conscious understanding of spirit, as you mentioned, in us as well as outside us and surrounding us. No, that's beautiful, and that gives you such peace and contentment and ability to function to your maximum, and not be competitive per se, but simply maximizing your potential, in terms of your gifts from the divinity, if you will, as opposed, to a system. And maybe I don't want to get to the opposed system just yet. But that was the glue that held us together. Now, definitely at a superficial level, of course, you would have conflict in terms of one group in one area encroaching on another group in another area. Let's say, the Fulani, who may have been, cattle herders or what have you, and not sedentary agriculture is moving from one area into the other area. So you have these kind of societal or political conflicts, if you will, which can lead to war and obviously emphasize the divisions in terms of the culture.
Greetings, I'm Robin Walker of The Black Secret. Keen to popularize Pan-African heritage, we have 2 products that should interest you. We are giving away an introductory free book called 100 Black History Facts. Secondly, our online course, The Black Secret, has 55 hours of filmed content. You will systematically learn every major theme in our history, going all the way back.
Of the different people.
Can I jump in there, sir?
Please do, yeah.
But what's interesting about the conflict is they're not religious conflicts. They're not spiritual conflicts.
Mm-hmm.
They're not A conquers B, therefore A converts B to their religion and tells B that their religion is nonsense. It's not that. Do you see? And that's a very, very important thing, you see. Our religions were spread not by conquest. They were spread by culture. They were spread by, I mean, if you look at, for example, the most extraordinary situation of the 20th century, the rise and spread of Rastafari. If you compare that to, say, the rise and spread of any of the so-called monotheistic religions, as Professor John Henrik Clarke said, a lot of them have got murder cult histories. Rastafari is in Japan, and it wasn't spread by any kind of violence. It was spread by people liking the livity and deciding to get with the livity. Absolutely no force, absolutely no compulsion. And I think that is a superior historical record of how you spread a spirituality compared to doing it at the sword or at the point of the gun.
I think there's a concept there as well. Is that if we are made in the image of God, and we manifest that image, I don't manifest it any differently from you manifest it. If you understand, yourself in terms of your relationship to God and your perception of God. So how can I convert you when you're already a manifestation of God in terms of my spirituality or my religion? It's simply a matter of different superficial characteristics of how we manifest that same God, which is in each of us. So there's no conversion. We're born, as spiritual beings having a physical experience, and all you have to do is understand your spirituality to maximize, your experience. And as you mentioned, conversion is ridiculous. Someone who's born in the image of God, how can you convert them to God? I mean, they're already God, and it's important. And a point I think that is important in terms of African spirituality, and if you will, religion, we really do have an understanding that we are made in the image of God, and God created us to manifest that image. Where I think you find that the Abrahamic or even Christian religions per se create God in their image, so that God is very much a mental construct, and is being refined. I mean, it's the ultimate anthropomorphism, if you will, to create in your own image. And I think that's still really a specific difference between African religion and other religions, shall we say. And that includes, I would say most of them, certainly in the Judeo-Christian tradition.
And you're right. What then happens is once they create God in their own image, it then becomes a tool of European supremacy. And it then results in all kinds of nonsense. If I can mention only in passing, because I know it's a hot topic, but what's going on right now in the Middle East, in the Levant area, you've got people fighting over land and people claiming that it's theirs because chosen people this and chosen people that. And a lot of these ideas come from a kind of arrogance that comes when people can create God in their own image and then use that to deify their image and then use it as a weapon against other groups of people.
I think what you just said is mind-boggling. And they then deify their own image, and that's exactly what white supremacy is, a deification of white people. And that's that blowback, shall we say, from their creation of God in their image, and therefore they see themselves as gods. I think that's fabulous in terms of an explanation.
Yeah.
Another thing I just want to touch on too, because we have sort of discussed this and maybe haven't come to a conclusion, maybe can't come to a conclusion. But I see this as part of the two cradle theory, and you're probably going to have a difference in this of Sheikh Anta Diop in terms of the whole geographic climatic, meaning climate, so to speak, not climatic, but climate environment between, shall we say, the birth of Europeans and the original, birth of African people. Because if you look at our way of life and our religions, our way of life is natural. We really reverence nature. We try to understand nature. We try to live naturally. And our religions are nature religions. And you go all the way back again to Kemet, the symbolism, I think you mentioned it, of the pregnant hippopotamus, meaning, as a concept of conception, which is fabulous. And, or the crocodile as a concept of destruction, or, or the snake, in terms of the different things that you associate with the snake, or with Anubis, the animal that digests all of these things, and a symbol of transformation. So it's an enormous, deep study of nature and the functions of nature, which is nature neteru, as you know, and is also present in the Dogon and all of these other the natural forces, the divine forces that manifest in nature. So that this is understood by virtue of the milieu and investigating the milieu and coming to an understanding of the functionality of each of these things. This plant will give you this, that's edible, that's not edible, this is for medicine, etc., etc. I don't think you had that in terms of the birth of the European coming out of the Ice Age, where when you look outside, everything is frozen, there's snow all around you. Mother Nature is a bitch, if I can use that word, is not a very nice lady. And then, you have to go out into that weather and get some food. There are no trees, there are no plants, there are animals. So you have to go out there and kill. So you're isolated. You're cold, and you gotta go out there and kill something to eat. I think that does something to you, as opposed to, the lushness of our Garden of Eden, which we were never thrown out of. And I think you can follow that down the road in terms of culture and manifestation. I'm sorry, go ahead, Robin.
No, well said, sir. But here's the issue.
Yeah.
It is possible that us as scholars and historians and teachers are going to have to radically rework the two cradle theorem. For real. And I'm going to explain why. Here's the problem. When Professor Sheikh Anta Diop wrote that, the evidence seemed to suggest that Europeans have been around in their present form for about 22,000 years. When Dr. Finch wrote his superb Echoes of the Old Darkland, he was of the opinion that Europeans had been around for more than 34,000 years. The new theory is they haven't been around that long. In other words, it's possible that the Ice Age came and went, and there were still no people on the planet Earth of European heritage. So the new theories that people are advancing now is Europeans have been around. The longest possible time is probably 10,000 years. And the likeliest time is close to what the Honorable Elijah Muhammad said all along, 6,000 years. It's between 10 and 6. And therefore, certain populations that we used to think of as European. So, for example, it used to be thought that the earliest people in Europe, after Grimaldi man, was the Solutrean culture. It used to be thought that the Solutreans were white. That's not what the evidence is saying now. And so the result then is that the Cheddar Man, the first human in Britain that we know of, or what is today Britain, he's turned out to be black. An article and a documentary came out in Sweden where they talk about the very first Swedes, and they are quote unquote dark skinned, and all the alt-rightists came out in force to try and push back, but they couldn't push back because they don't have the counter evidence. Ireland, I have a news story where they've admitted that Ireland, the very first people there, were the same as Cheddar Man. The most recent one, you may have heard of a mummy that was found in Turkey, and it was originally thought to have been light-skinned, and I think the evidence came out within the last 2 months that it was actually dark-skinned. And the result then is that when we are looking for the presence of light-skinned people, you're not going to find anything before 10,000 years. And even in 10,000 years, it's going to be small pockets of populations. So what that means then is that it's quite possible that European culture is shaped by the harshness of Europe, but it wasn't shaped by the Ice Age because they don't go back far enough. And therefore, a lot of populations that we thought of as being non-black in complexion are now turning out to have been black. And if data is coming forward, such as the spread of European appearances is between 10,000 and 6,000 years ago, it also means that a lot of civilizations that we thought came out of the European Ice Age or whatever, a lot of that stuff would have been us. And consequently, we need to rethink and rework the two cradle theorem, because in other words, Diop was being generous when he said 22,000 years. That's not what the scholarship is saying now. And therefore, when it comes to Europeans and their contempt for God, their individualism, their culture of competition and aggression, all the things that Diop talks about, it may be a part of their culture, but it didn't come from the Ice Age. Why? Because they didn't exist.
Yeah, but there were descendants of the people who existed in the Ice Age, and you know, it's not so much a matter of complexion. I don't think we can. If you look at it from the DNA perspective, you know, and if you look at it from the perspective that we're all of one race, I think ultimately what we're saying, and we get back now to epigenetic science, meaning that there are things that work on the genes, if you will, in a simplified sense. You have a certain set of genes, and even though if you know they set out to map the genome, they haven't really done it because they found a lot of stuff that they don't know what it is, etc., and they don't know how it applies. So even science has gone that far. I mean, it's not comprehensive in that sense, because, for example, you know, I think that a butterfly may have almost as many genes as we have. So that's something more than just the number of genes spread out, you know, in a different fashion, chemical fashion. So if we say there's one human species, then we have to say there's one genome that carries the information that makes us humans. And then nowadays, of course, we now understand that changes in the environment or changes in your mindset can alter how your genes express themselves. It's an expression of the same genes, because then these things can turn on certain genes and turn off certain genes. And you know, to me, then I believe that this is the situation. Certain genes were turned on or off by the Ice Age, and of course we went over there. You know, as African people, we went over there. Dark-skinned African people, the Grimaldi. And somehow over time, and that may have happened, say, 40,000 years ago. And over time, between that and we used to say 15,000, now you're saying 10,000. Between that, when the first, white person was found in Europe. And I don't know what the number is now for the first Chinese person or a Mongolian person, not Mongoloid, was found, in Asia. So the numbers have to be reoriented. But I think the genetic facts, well, not that we know the genetic facts, but we create a genetics theory, that says that we all have the same genes, but when we live in a certain area, in a certain environment over a certain period of time, then our interaction with the environment then turns on certain genes and turns off certain genes. And it doesn't matter our skin complexion. And if you look, let's say you look at the United States of America, and subsequently post-slavery at the present time now, we have Black people who are in the Pentagon, or whatever his name is, as chief of the armed services, a Black man. We've had Black presidents, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Congressional Black Caucus, or if you will, and so on and so forth, expressing, very much the same ideology and manifesting the same behavior as both white counterparts. So they're now in the same environment, are being shaped by the same dynamic forces, and therefore their genes are being modified in the same way, so to speak. So I have not abandoned my two cradle theory. I rest it now on a genetic basis.
No, well said, sir.
Okay. Interesting. But I genuinely believe that, and it has some scientific basis, but of course you can't prove it in that sense. But it makes some degree of sense, and it allows you to be somewhat comfortable in explanations of what have happened in terms of history, and because the alternative is to say, well, some people aren't quite human. I don't want to say who, but some people are quite human, and maybe they have more than 3 or 5% Neanderthal in them, et cetera, et cetera. It's not that intellectually acceptable at this point in time. So I think we have to give everybody a human status and explain differences in some other way.
All I'm calling for is our scholars to look at the two cradle theorem and work on it some more and evolve it. That's what I'm calling for. The other thing too that I think we need to have a discussion about, again, you've talked about African spirituality. With person, divinity, and nature, Dr. Chukwunyere Kamalu identifies 5 elements that our ancestors identified that make up a human being, and why that is an important discussion that we need to be having when it comes to traditional African spirituality. So when you think of a human being, what makes you you? Well, if you listen to people like the French philosopher René Descartes, he said mind and body. When we then look at from traditional African perspectives, you've got this idea that human beings could be made up of more than just mind and body. And they've given names and concepts to what these different entities that make up a human being are. And inspired by this, Professor Naim Akbar wrote a book called The Community of Self. And the idea that you are made up of more than one element. And these elements, we could look at them as spiritual elements, or we could look at them as psychological elements. And again, it shows the sophisticated thought processes behind the way our ancestors thought of what makes up a human being.
Yeah, we definitely will go into that, in depth, because it's basic, and it goes all the way back again to Kemet, well, let's just say Nile Valley civilizations, in terms of an understanding of, shall we say, mind, and we're going to have to define mind in two different ways.
Greetings, I'm Robin Walker of The Black Secret. Keen to popularize Pan-African heritage, we have two products that should interest you. We are giving away an introductory free book called 100 Black History Facts. Secondly, our online course, The Black Secret, has 55 hours of filmed content. You will systematically learn every major theme in our history, going all the way back.
Mind with a big M, capital M-I-N-D, and then mind with a small M-I-N-D. And mind with the small M-I-N-D is what can be considered the psyche. And this is what Western psychology, going back to Freud and Jung and all these people, this is what they were talking about, because they had no understanding of big mind, because big mind is really spirit or consciousness, shall we say, consciousness that is conscious of itself. So they knew only the psychological factors, and those psychological factors really, have a lot to do with your perceptive ability, your identity as a mind-body complex that you just mentioned. Who am I? I am my mind, and I'm this physical self. So and that's where my information comes from, the five senses, and nowhere else. Because that's all that I identify with. So we have the intelligence. We have the ego, which grasps at everything in terms of sensory input. We have the sensory input through our perceptive apparatus, and that then is mind, and that was considered to be the person in the body. The body was there for the sensory information to come in. The mind is there to deal with the information in whatever way the ego wants, and then the ego decides what to do in terms of activity of the body, and that's the understanding of the human being. Of course, an understanding of a human persona, but it's not a full understanding of the human being. You see, but that's a European understanding of the self, and it's purely materialistic, because the body is a materialistic entity that brings material information through the five senses, and that's as far as European understanding went. And that gave birth to scientific materialism, and it gave birth to philosophy, and all philosophy means really is playing with different ideas from that psyche or mind. There's nothing original in terms of its creative ability. It can only deal with modification of things that they identify, from nature, and therefore that's what has happened through this whole period of science taking over from religion, going through the Middle Ages and coming forward. So we have a civilization based on scientific materialism, which really has to do with a mind-body complex and has nothing to do with the full person, which is different from the African perspective, which is big mind, which includes spirit. Now, spirit is big mind, and spirit is what connects us to source, which is divinity. So we are manifestations of divinity. Of course, nowadays, quantum physics is called that the unified field. Well, you can call it God, or you can call it the unified field. You can call it the primeval nu. Whatever your word is, you can call it the Akashic field. I mean, different civilizations over time have had different words for it. But quotes, we've all known about it except for the European perspective. They just found it at the birth of quantum physics. Before that, Einstein understood something about energy and matter, but he didn't understand anything about consciousness. He thought the manifestation of consciousness was spooky stuff at a distance, which he couldn't understand. So, one of their most brilliant minds, or one of the most brilliant minds ever within that cage of scientific materialism, could not understand, what consciousness was doing, and that consciousness was primary. Then took all of this other stuff, for that to happen. But this has been part of the understanding of African people, and not just an understanding intellectually, but an experience. You see, it's there as an experience of your spiritual nature and your spiritual self. The understanding, again, God and nature first made us what we are, and then out of our own creative genius, we make ourselves what we want to be. That link, as you're talking about, between, divinity, person, and nature. This is primordial in African understanding, going back again to our earlier civilizations. And all across Africa, you'll find it. And, as you mentioned, you mentioned Mbiti and others, certain Sindima, as well as, Kamalu is his name. Yes.
That's right.
As well as Kamalu, and others have identified this in all of the different nations or entities, shall we say, within Africa, from the Dogon to the Bantu and on and on. So we understand, mind from the perspective of big mind. Now, what big mind is the spirit that manifests itself through the functionality of little mind, if you will. But it's little mind that is not conditioned, because little mind is conditioned, by belief systems, by your rituals and by your educational process in terms of your knowledge base. This is all within little mind. It's facts, but it's not wisdom. And that's why Europe doesn't really have a philosophy. If you look, philosophy is the love of wisdom. Well, maybe they love wisdom, but they don't have wisdom, if you know what I'm saying. If they have an intellectual argumentation, that is Socratic and doesn't lead anywhere. Dialectic, discussions about what if, and I believe, and I think, as opposed to what you think and what you believe, and you go around in circles, because you cannot come to a conclusion, because a conclusion means certainty. Certainty can come from experience. I have eaten an apple. I know what an apple tastes like. I'm certain about it because I've had that experience. But if you haven't had experience, you can say, well, what is that? That's an apple, and it's red, and it's sweet, and blah, 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 blah. And you can talk about it infinitely, about the characteristics and its facts. But until you've experienced eating the apple, you can't say that I know what an apple is. And that's the difference, I think, between, the African spirituality and the religiosity of these other religions that have been, shall we say, reshaping the African understanding of self. And we have to understand the difference between big mind and little mind, because big mind then uses little mind to function with, but it's little mind that is not conditioned, by that knowledge base that is out there, but can use that knowledge base because it has a wider perspective in terms of understanding, and because also it gathers information from beyond the five senses. And this is something that our scholars have not gotten into. But of course, it's happening now a lot here in the West. People are beginning to understand about, clairvoyance and experiences outside the body and all of these things. But all of that is already, within African spirituality. And for example, voodoo, it's a way to influence the psyche or the mind through spirit and vibrations and so on, and you know how much understanding you can get through, you know, non-sensory perception. You can walk into a room and sense the feeling that is going on in the room.
That's very true.
You can meet a person, and your spirit can take him, or your spirit says no. That, you know, that person is not somebody you want to associate with. But we don't identify those things as faculties that we have and maximize those faculties. Some Africans do, and they are the spiritual masters, shall we say, in our tradition. I'm talking too much. Jump in.
All right. Also, can I just jump in one more thing as well,
Please.
sir? I think another thing that needs to be said about traditional African belief systems is their ability to reproduce themselves and put systems and structures in place to raise children, especially the transition from child to adulthood, and the rituals that are in place to turn a child into an adult. The kind of thing that happens between the ages of, say, 10 and 15 in traditional African societies, where the spirituality and the customs would then be used to initiate boys into manhood and girls into womanhood, and how that enables a community to reproduce itself, and the importance, a lot of these things that have been lost in the West, because there isn't, with the exception of the Jewish bar mitzvah and bat mitzvah, a lot of Western tradition doesn't really have the kind of boy to manhood, girl to womanhood thing. And the traditional African systems, this is something that I've specifically researched, have very, very detailed programs to turn boys into men and girls into women.
Yeah, I think that's definitely lacking, because, you know, it's quite obvious that there are stages to life. There's baby, there's childhood, you know, there's the teenage, you know, then there's adulthood, and then there's old age, and all of these are transitions. And one has to know how to make these transitions. And you know, by learning from people who have made these transitions before. And you certainly know if it's a part of the tradition of your culture. And you say we've lost that because it's not a part of Western culture, and it has been taken away from us essentially. And nowadays, you know, old people are considered to be passé because the society is not only based on individualism, but it's based on technology. And the old folks know the most recent technology. The most recent technology is known by the youngest people. You know, they're 5 years old and they can take up the cell phone and do whatever it is. So what do we need grandpa for? Grandpa is useless. You know what I mean? He's a troglodyte. But he has accumulated the wisdom of whatever, 80 years, 70 years, and so on and so forth. So it's a civilization that's defeating itself. It's a technological civilization, an industrial civilization. But as my father said, you know, it's doomed to fail because it has no spiritual essence, it has no values, and it's a total immoral civilization. So it's collapsing as we speak. And you know, and that manifests itself in so many ways, and you know that you don't even want to go there. In terms of, you know, young people, 12, 13, 14, being sexually active and so on and so forth. You know, teenagers, you know, with drug abuse, committing suicides and what have you. And, you know, just to speak to that age group that you're talking about, that don't have any training. At best, they go to school and learn X. But who is responsible for X, what they learn? They learn what society wants them to learn, which is to go to the mall and buy stuff, and you know, and you want to work hard enough to be able to buy as much as you want. And
And
all
can I jump in there, sir?
control has been removed. Just my last point here before you take over. You know, all parental control has been removed. You can't discipline your child. If you do, even if your child reports it to the teacher or the police, they'll come and put you in jail. I mean, it's ridiculous. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, and the reason I'm bringing this up is because when it comes to traditional African belief systems, this is where they have superior value. And it's not value that is ancient. It's not value that is medieval. This is value that is useful now. Because if you were to put a lot of our young urban people through such a system, right now, if you were to do it in London, if you were to do it in Kingston, if you were to do it in Atlanta, the quality of young men and women that we could produce through such a system, our crime rates would drop. Gang activity we could stamp out. Do you see? And these are the enduring values. But if people think that traditional African religion has no value, we're not going to probe it for value, for how these ideas can be used right now to address certain sociological problems right now, the way that they were addressed back in the day. And so I'm saying that these religious and spiritual traditions have current usage.
Absolutely, absolutely, absolutely. And that's one of the things that we have to do is reformat those values and that understanding in terms of contemporary terms, so young people can understand it and be not only attracted to it, but allow themselves to be disciplined by it, because it's the only way. It's the only way out. I think, as you mentioned, you know, we need to go into the identity of the person in depth, and we'll do that next time in terms of the different components of our personality. And that's what it is. They're different components. They don't stand alone, but they're different components of one unity, one entity. And definitely we'll get into that next time. And we have to move towards, you know, how then do we manifest this, as you're saying? I don't want to use the word so much ritual, because ritual to me, you know, has a little bit of a negative meaning, and not just in terms of African ritual, but in terms of any ritual, because ritual very often becomes a substitute for the real thing. You know, the real thing may have started out, and it becomes dogma, and it becomes ritual, and then you don't understand the essence. But what we're talking about is the essence of a spiritual identity, and then how that functions on a material plane on an everyday basis in terms of education, in terms of religion, in terms of economics, and in terms of politics. I think that kind of thing, you know, has to be made plain, because one derives from the other, and spirit drives mind, and mind drives matter, and that's what we're talking about, to manifest that African person. You know, I think you know, Kwame Nkrumah was looking for that African personality, which he was trying to create with his conscientism. I don't think he got there. I think my dad, before him, was talking about the African mind and African spirituality, and I think he was more on target. But it certainly, you know, this is 100 years later, and we need to update whatever in terms of our understanding. So I look forward to that. Last words?
No, thank you, sir. It's been a very, very fruitful discussion.
I've enjoyed it myself. Always with you, Robin. Thanks. Until next.
Big respect, sir. All right, have a good one.
Good.